Right. Thank you, Folani. That's quite a long intro about me. Um, Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to share a few experiences with you. And as Holani mentioned, I'll be talking to you about this peer review process, understanding it, what it means, and particularly for emerging researchers, how to overcome the hurdles that usually comes along with it. Now, when we hear about peer review, this is what typically comes to mind. So you've gone through all the hassle and the struggle and the challenges of writing a paper, and you want the paper to be published. But there are a lot of hurdles that you must navigate. And if you are successful, then your paper will be accepted and published at the end of the race. If you are not successful midway, you can be kicked out, or sometimes even right up front, your paper could be rejected. So I just want to briefly explain what the peer review process is all about. Now, when we talk about the peer review process, essentially, we are looking at the process of subjecting your work, or if you're an author, your scholarly work, your ideas, to the scrutiny of others. We want others to scrutinize it, and not just any group of people or bunch of people, but experts in the field, so that the ideas that eventually get published, we will be sure are of high quality and indeed having improved based on suggestions given by these expert reviewers. Now, usually there are different types of peer review processes. The types of peer review that a journal uses will depend on the nature of the discipline and other factors. But there is one common aspect of all the models that are out there, which is that there should be transparency in the way the review is carried out. Now, there are three common ones, and of course, there are several others, but the three common types of peer review processes that we have out there are the single blind. When we say single blind, essentially, what it means is that the reviewer knows the name of the authors, but the authors do not know who reviewed their manuscript. So if you submit your paper to a journal, and the journal's policy is to have a single blind, it means whoever reviews your paper will know who you are, because your name will be out there, your name will be on the paper, but you will not know who reviewed the paper. And this anonymity of the reviewer allows them to be impartial, and it protects them from being influenced by the authors. Now, there is a second type, which is a double blind. And this is the case where both the reviewer and the author do not know each other. The advantage of this model are that the author anonymity, in a way, limits the possibility of bias. And that bias sometimes could be based on maybe the author's own academic status, their publication record, maybe the institution they come from, even the agenda, or sometimes even the country of origin. And having this double blind review is a way of ensuring that that bias is not supported in there. It's ruled out. Now, when we talk about the open peer review, it's simply a collective term for many models which have been created to provide more transparency during and after the review process. And the most common example of the open review is when both the reviewer and the author recognize each other during the review process. So the authors know who the reviewers are, and the reviewers know who the authors are. If the manuscript is accepted, the named reviewer reports are also published alongside the article, and the author's response to the reviewer is also published. So broadly, these are the three main categories. Now let's get to the main aspect. Who are typically the reviewers? Now, when we talk about peer reviews, we are not referring to strangers or people who do not come from Earth. We are referring to people who are in the field in which you are writing your paper. So if you're in economics and you're specialized in a certain area of economics, you may not be the only one who is specializing and writing papers in that area. There could be several others. And any of these several others could be a peer review. It could be a mixture of young, old. So you can have a broad range of people who, based on their expertise, will be qualified to review your paper. And from experience, often the young reviewers are the most responsive, and they deliver some of the best quality reviews, though this is not always the case. Now, for emerging researchers, I think you would want to, or you may want to understand how the entire review process works. And so what I have here is simply a representation of the peer review process. This is not a definitive approach used by every journal, but it defines, or it gives us the most common route that papers go through when they are submitted to a journal. And I'll take my time to unpack each step and what happens at each step and what you can do to perhaps sail through the challenges identified at each step. So let's begin with step one. The peer review process only begins when you, as an author or a researcher, has completed a research. And once you complete that research study, you're going to write a manuscript. That manuscript is going to describe things like the purpose of the paper, the experimental design, the results, the conclusion of the study. So once you have done this, you're going to look for a suitable journal and submit your manuscript to that suitable journal. That journal perhaps will be one that specializes in the relevant field. So for me, who, for instance, writes on market co-movement, I'll be looking for papers, journals which publishes papers similar to what I have written. And at this stage, I mean, this is the most crucial stage. At this stage, the journal editor receives your paper. So when you submit, it will typically land on the desk of the editor-in-chief or the managing editor of the journal, who is going to now screen the paper. So if you recall the first image which I showed you, and I'm going to take you back briefly, the picture which I showed you earlier, you will see the guy with a sword. Take it as he being the editor-in-chief or the managing editor or the handling editor of the journal. Once you submit a paper, it will land on his desk. And the journal editor is going to now review the paper to ensure that the subject matter is in line with that of the journal. So if your work is about stock market co-movement and you decide to submit it to, say, a journal which publishes microeconomic stuff, or a journal which publishes sociology stuff, one, you know you've shot yourself in the foot. There is that misalignment, okay? So you need to know the scope of the journal. And here the editor-in-chief or the managing editor is going to ensure that your work indeed aligns with that of the journal, what the journal scope is. It fits the editorial platform. And here, fitting the editorial platform simply means, in terms of word count, if the journal requires maximum 8,000 words, you are not submitting 12,000 words to them. If they require their references to be done in a certain style, let's say APA, You are not sending them Harvard. If they require you to submit cover letters, you are not ignoring that. Or maybe they want your tables to be numbered in a certain way and arranged in a separate file. You are fulfilling all of those conditions. So a few papers, very few papers pass this initial condition. And there are a lot of reasons why this is the case. Sometimes, as I alluded to earlier, articles are simply sent to the wrong journal. And sometimes even the style of the paper, it's not written in the form of a journal article. But sometimes perhaps too journalistic. Or maybe you simply take a chapter of your thesis and submit it with the hope that reviewers are going to tell you, rearrange it this way. No, it will be rejected right at the onset by the editor-in-chief. So you need to take some of these reasons into consideration. The paper may be too long, the style of writing may be very bad, grammar, punctuation, and sometimes it fails to say anything of significance. It makes no contribution to the subject or simply states the obvious at tedious length. So some of these reasons may result in a rejection right at the desk of the editor-in-chief or the managing editor. Now, if your paper passes this hurdle, okay, it will then go through the peer review process. If the editor feels that it sufficiently meets the requirements, but is written by a credible source, it will then be taken through the peer review process. And it is the responsibility of the editor here to select the most appropriate manuscript for the journal. So they have to make sure that all of these criteria are fulfilled. They have to ensure that the review is conducted in a fair and timely manner and effectively as well. And they also have to ensure that there are no conflicts of interest when it comes to the entire peer review process. Just an example of what I said about knowing the scope of a journal. Every journal has an about this journal page, and it's up to you as the author who wants to or desires to publish in that journal to read that about page carefully. In there, they're going to tell you what they publish and what they do not publish. So this is an example from the African Review of Economics and Finance, of which I'm the editor, and we clearly spell out what we are going to publish and what we are not going to publish. A second example is from Economic Modeling. And here again, you can see the journal clearly spells out what types of work it publishes and what it doesn't publish. So you need to know this as an author before you submit a paper to them, else you risk being desk rejected. Now, let's suppose you've passed the hurdle of the editor-in-chief and your paper has now been sent to reviewers. Reviewers are going to look at 4 critical things here, typically. Mostly they're going to consider whether the research question is important, it's original, they may also want to look at the structure of the paper itself, whether it's logical, whether there is proper alignment. What does an abstract say? What does the introduction say? What does the methodology say? The title of the paper itself, okay? So for instance, you may want to have a title which is descriptive enough. It is clear, it is concise, so that when someone reads the title of the paper, they know what this paper is about, okay? You don't confuse your reviewers. The abstract must be sufficiently informative. And the content of the abstract itself should be consistent with the rest of the paper. So you don't want to present something in the abstract, which when people read the paper later, they get a different story. You would have misled your review, and sometimes this could lead to a rejection. You come to the meat of the paper itself, starting with the introduction, okay? Introduction You may want to present the research question in the context of, for instance, what is already known about the topic, in order to identify why that research question is being studied, and whether it's indeed of interest, it's properly motivated. The reviewer is going to look at something like your method section. And here you would want your methods to be detailed enough. And when someone reads a method, they should be able to replicate what you say you've done by simply reading your methods. Sometimes even the language in which the method is written. And mostly here we encourage you to write in the past tense. The reviewer is going to look at all of this and ensure that the method is detailed enough. A section like the results, here again, most reviewers are going to look for sufficient details. The results are credible. The text in the result is consistent with the information presented in the tables and figures. So you give us tables and figures, which maybe tells us you've run a regression. The coefficient or the beta that you're expecting is indeed positive, but maybe it's not statistically significant. But you're drawing meanings as if it is statistically significant, okay? So that consistency between what is in the tables and figures and the text is all going to be looked at. Even table captions should be appropriate, both contextually and in length. And then sections like the discussion. Here, reviewers are going to look at all of that. And so you would want your paper to be written in a very sweet way, in a convincing way. Now, what happens after the reviewer has read your paper? There are 3 common recommendations from peer reviewer reports. In very rare instances, they are going to tell you, well, the paper should be accepted. This is so rare. I have hardly come across it, and none of the papers I've published has received this recommendation before, that the reviewer simply says the paper should be accepted. If you're lucky, then the paper simply goes into production and gets published. Now, at the other extreme is having your paper rejected. And here, there'll be reasons for rejection. The reviewer's job is to write a detailed report, although sometimes you have reviewers who are not detailed enough. They give you something very scanty, and the editor also, based on that, may simply reject your paper. When this happens, I usually tell people that all is not lost. It doesn't mean your work belongs to the bin. You simply have to rework it and try another journal. Now, what we mostly look out for is a revise and resubmit decision. And this is what you would want to receive after your paper has gone through peer review, to be told that it needs revisions, make revisions, sometimes minor revisions, sometimes major revisions. And here you're going to make the revisions as an author. And once you've made all those revisions, you send the paper back to the editor. The editor assesses your revision and how you've responded to reviewer comments. If need be, the paper will be sent back to the reviewer again to indeed satisfy the editor that the comments have been appropriately addressed and the paper has been restructured in a way that is logical and indeed makes contribution to the field in which it's supposed to belong. So in the end, the manuscript can be accepted or may be accepted after the revision, or it can even be rejected after the revision. And in all of this, the editor is going to be the mediator between the author and the referee. So simply, this is how the peer review process works. In the interest of time, I'm going to stop here. And I think when we come to the Q&A, I'll be happy to address any other questions that you may have around the peer review process. Thank you.